We'll have Ambassador Navtej Singh Sarna as our next eminent speaker this evening. Navtej is a diplomat who was Indian ambassador to the United States. He previously served as the High Commissioner of India to United Kingdom and the ambassador to Israel. He has been a secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs. He's also an author, columnist, and can be watched on television debates off and on. Born in 1957 at Jalandhar, his father, Mahinder Singh Sarna, was a noted writer in Punjabi, and his mother, Surjit Singh Sarna, a Punjabi poet and translator. He did his schooling from St. Joseph's Academy, Dehradun. Later, he joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1980. He was the longest serving spokesperson of Indian Foreign Ministry for 6 years, under 2 prime ministers, 3 foreign ministers, 4 foreign secretaries, till the end of his term in September 2008. Early years of his service, he served in various diplomatic posts in Moscow, Poland, Bhutan, Iran, Washington, and Geneva. He served as India's ambassador to Israel from 2008 to 2012, High Commissioner to UK 2016, and as India's ambassador to the United States from November 2016 to December 2018, and retired from the Indian Foreign Service in December 2018 after serving the country for over 36 years. Navtej is also an established author of both fiction and non-fiction. He wrote Folk Tales of Poland in 1991. His first published novel was the We Weren't Lovers Like That, 2003. The Book of Nanak was published in the same year. The Exile, published in 2008, is a novel based on the life of Dalip Singh, the last Maharaja of Sikh Empire and son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. His short stories, which appeared earlier in London Magazine and broadcast over BBC, have been put together in the collection Winter Evenings 2012. He translated the Zafarnama, the letter written in Persian verse by Guru Gobind Singh to Emperor Aurangzeb. Savage Harvest in 2013 is Sarna's translation of 30 of his father's short stories on the partition of India from Punjabi to English. He wrote Indians at Herod's Gate, a Jerusalem narrative, 2014. He's been a prolific columnist and commentator on policy, literacy, cultural matters, contributing regularly to journals in India and abroad. His literary column, written over 7 years for The Hindu, have now appeared as a book titled Second Thoughts on Books, Authors, and Writerly Life. Came out in 2015. In 2022, he wrote Crimson Spring on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The book has been awarded the Kalinga Literary Festival Prize for the best fiction book of 2022. In addition to English, Hindi, Punjabi, the ambassador speaks and is knowledgeable of Russian and Polish languages. He's married to Dr. Avina Sarna and has 1 son and 1 daughter. Ambassador Sarna is today on the advisory member of the board of US India Strategic Partnership Forum, advisory board members of Kautilya School of Public Policy, and an independent member of the National Broadcasting and Digital Standards Authority. He also sits on the Governing Council of Sri Ram College of Commerce, SRCC, Delhi. He is also the patron of the Kushwant Singh Literary Festival in London. He was invited to be the visiting fellow at All Souls College, Oxford University in 2022. Today, we are 2 days short of 100 since Israel-Hamas conflict began, and the end is far from sight. Worldview is divided, though there is now a level of sympathy for Palestinians, civilians who are bearing the brunt and facing heavy death toll. Meanwhile, Houthis have become aggressive and have been launching huge drone and missile attacks targeting ships in Red Sea. They are seen at the front of the Iran-Saudi Arabia proxy war. The United States has been a major player in the region. We couldn't have had a more eminent speaker to talk to us on United States' role in West Asia and the evolving global order. There are some great videos of Navtej here which you can watch on the internet. We are really looking forward to listening to him today. Other than the speaker and me, all will remain muted. After his talk, we will have a Q&A session that will be conducted by Air Vice Marshal Anil Gulani, Additional Director General SCAPS. You are requested to put your questions in the chat box. Over to you, Ambassador Sarna now.
Thank you very much, Air Marshal Chopra. Thank you for that very detailed introduction. I don't know where you got the biodata from, but I must take a copy from you. It looks good. And good evening to all the listeners and the members of this very distinguished body. It's a privilege to be addressing such senior officers of the Indian Air Force. And I try to do my best because I know that all of you are experts in strategic affairs and have served in different places and in different very responsible positions. So I'd like to make it as interactive as possible and also take this into some direction, the direction that you would like to do so. But I think what I would do is spend the initial moments, as I've been given half an hour to 40 minutes, to talk about some of the issues that lie at the back of the US involvement in what we call West Asia, the West calls Middle East, but basically it's the same. I started with this particular slide, which I'm not going to go to explain, but just to show that this is basically the area that we consider Middle East or West Asia. Afghanistan is sometimes included, sometimes not included. From our point of view, if you see the divisions in the Ministry of External Affairs, then Afghanistan is not covered by the West Asia, North Africa division, which essentially covers the Middle East, plus, of course, the Gulf division, and Afghanistan comes along with Pakistan. So for our purposes today, I'll also leave it out. The other reason for putting up this is that this gives a very broad indication of the presence of the US. It's a couple of years old, this map, but essentially it shows you the various bases in this area held by the United States. And I know that you are all familiar with this kind of deployment. And these are not necessarily bases which are manned only by the Americans or run only by the Americans. Many of them have host partnerships, etc. So we won't go into that. But the simple thing is, what a point I wanted to make is that the US has had, for the last 75 years, the primacy in this area in terms of any of the great powers. And that is something which we have to keep in mind as we go into the discussion. My thought was that I should actually build up a little historical perspective of how the US presence and policy there has evolved over the decades, so that the present situation then begins to make more sense. Of course, I know on everybody's mind it is today the Israel-Palestine issue, and I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A if we like. But at the moment, I'd like to keep the focus as requested on the US. Now, if we go back to World War II and later, essentially the United States had three objectives, which you can see on the screen. One was the free flow of oil. It's not that the United States did not have the oil. The United States, in fact, was producing 60% of the world's oil at the time of the war. And it helped its allies, particularly Britain and France, immensely that the US had so much oil. And this the Germans did not have, and that became another factor. But then the United States decided that, oil is such a valuable thing. Why don't we get it from elsewhere, and why don't we let our oil stay in the ground? By that time, Saudi oil had been discovered. Some Chevron and Texaco, which were essentially American companies, had discovered big oil wells in the 30s in Saudi Arabia. The second objective was the survival and security of Israel, to which the US was immediately committed as soon as Israel became independent and a Jewish homeland was formed in Palestine in 1948. And the third, around the same time, was the beginning of the Cold War and the fear that Soviet Union and by implication communism would hold an immense sway in this area. So we must limit it by being present, by building our alliances, etc. And now those of you who are familiar with American political history of the 50s and the idea of McCarthyism, etc., the idea of communist influence spreading was very fundamental to the US policy constructs. So that was the third reason. Now, the fourth reason that got added on was, which has been really the predominant reason right through after that, was after 9/11, when nuclear non-proliferation, essentially Iran, and counterterrorism, essentially because of the terrorist threat that the US suddenly began to perceive from the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, suddenly came home. I was reading an article this morning by Bruce Riedel, one of the non-proliferation experts, who wrote that Al-Qaeda's attack, the 9/11 attack, there were so many warnings, there was so much intelligence, which was ignored at the topmost levels of the Bush presidency and the Bush White House. But then when the planes hit the World Trade Center, now that threat certainly came home. And this was an objective which got added. Because if they're Middle East, even including Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda presence, the ISIS presence, the Syrian groups, the Iranian groups, all of them have become the fourth objective. Now, the agency through which the US has been maintaining its presence is multifaceted. There is, of course, foreign aid, huge amounts. There are military bases. There's a naval presence in the Gulf and today even in the Mediterranean. As you have seen, they have sent 2 aircraft and striker groups after the outbreak in Gaza. There's military assistance and there's arms sales. Now, 50% of American global arms sales go to this area. 50% of the military aid, the military assistance, goes to this area, to Israel, to Egypt, to Jordan, to the UAE. So there is a huge investment of the American presence. And besides this, there is a doctrine called the Carter Doctrine, which came through in the 70s, which brings together the strategic, the military, as well as the economic policies of the United States, the trade policies, the economic policies. And through those, for instance, they have several FTAs, free trade agreements, with Israel, with Jordan, with the UAE, etc. They have a huge amount of economic investment in several of these countries. So those also are dovetailed into the strategic policies. So this is the broad sort of background of the objectives and the presence. Now, where did this all begin? If you see this slide, it's basically on Valentine's Day in 1945 on the USS destroyer Quincy, which was parked there's a small lake in the Suez Canal. Those of you who must have sailed through that would have known. And this was a meeting held there. This was a very important meeting. This was a very strange meeting because these are, very unlikely chaps to get together on a US destroyer deck. You have FDR, Roosevelt, who was for the fourth time the elected president of the most important or the most powerful country, about to win Second World War. And you had the King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, who before this had never been outside his country. He had no experience of international diplomacy. All he had to his credit is one short visit to Iraq. And he was not used to or meeting presidents, etc. He was a king and an absolute autocrat who had built together Saudi Arabia. But FDR wanted this meeting. He was a very powerful man. He was just coming from Yalta after the summit with Churchill and Stalin, at which and this was a secret meeting because he felt that the British would get very annoyed because they regarded the Middle East as their preserve, the French and the British. But the Americans, there were 2 points in this meeting, and both are relevant today. One was oil. He wanted to have greater American concessions for oil from the king. And the second was that please give your agreement to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he wanted to send 10,000 Jews immediately into Palestine to form the homeland. They were already gathering there. Interestingly, the king, of course, gave no answers on the oil. Later on, it did work out. Aramco was formed, which was the Arab-American oil company, and which together the Americans and Saudis got a huge amount of oil out there. And in return, the United States gave security assurances and security protection. And on the Jewish homeland, the king said, no way, send the Jews to Bavaria, because the Germans have done what they have done to them, and you must carve out a part of Germany to make a Jewish homeland. Now, this, of course, never happened, but that's probably a long story for another day. But the important thing was that this is where the relationship began. Earlier on, in the earlier part of the 20th century, the US was not at all involved to any significant extent in the Middle East. After this, a pipeline was sanctioned by Saudi Arabia into the Mediterranean. Military training started by the Americans of Saudi forces. An air base was put near the oil wells, and so on and so forth. A relationship which has never looked back. Every single president has courted Saudi Arabia. Nobody to the extent of Donald Trump, who was absolutely sycophantic about the Saudis, and he even boasted that he had sold this huge consignment of arms to them, which was actually never sold, if you read the fine print. But all of them have made this massive effort to court the Saudis, and the problems. But there are problems today, which we can come down later. But this is where really things began. Trying to get to the next one. Yeah, the second important thing which really governs the entire relationship is the American relationship with Israel. And this I have for you here on the screen on the right is the original note which Harry Truman signed, recognizing the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel. Now, on 48, this was done 11 minutes after Israel declared itself independent in 1948. And you all know the history, how the partition plan was junked, and then Israel declared itself independent. The war started with the Arabs and all that. But within 11 minutes, Truman recognized, he became the world's first leader to recognize Israel. Now, he had several reasons. Broadly, I've just put 3 categories up there. Of course, there were the moral reasons. There was this huge moral Western guilt about the Holocaust, which still is playing out today. The second was political. The 48 election was coming up, the presidential election, and Truman felt that recognition of Israel would really help him with the Jewish vote in the United States. And the third, again, was strategic. Again, that if we have a strong ally, we have a democracy, we have people who are beholden to us because we are supporting them, then they will be our permanent, reliable ally against communism, against Soviet influence, against all sorts of things that may happen in the. Now, this, between these two slides, which I've shown you, the entire relationship of US with the Middle East basically is pinned. You know, the strong commitment to Israel, the strong commitment to Saudi Arabia, the strategic reasons behind that. Of course, there are other factors like Iran, etc. But this forms the fundamentals which comes in again and again when you see anything happening in the Middle East. Now, broadly, several ways the United States maintained its influence, and I've put in two of these things. One was, there was a huge desire the United States felt that the Europeans were somehow queering the pitch. So let's remember that for Israel, it was not the United States which was the first partner who started supporting them with weapons and money and etc. The American assistance to Israel in the early years was more of an economic nature, food, etc., and money and loans and all that. But it was the British and particularly the French. The French gave the first tanks, etc., to Israel. The French were big partners. And here on the left side, you see the Suez Crisis, which was 1956. Now, this was the first time when the Americans figured that, they really also get a diplomatic and a strategic relationship going with Israel. Otherwise, the British and the French will keep meddling. So here, Nasser, after he had nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel together invaded Egypt. And the Americans then had to do a pushback. They had to tell them to, go back. They had to tell them, they went against them in the United Nations. And they made sure that after that, the European influence was nowhere near what their own influence on Israel would be. Because what the last thing that the Americans wanted was its NATO allies getting into a conflict with the Soviet Union over Middle East. Because when the Suez Canal happened and these colonial armies or the European armies invaded Egypt, Khrushchev said that I'm going to bomb London. So, it was, Eisenhower was very clear. He did not want this conflagration. He did not want this conflict. So he pushed back on his allies. And the second important thing was the Americans got into mediation, which you see here in the 78, 79, the Camp David Accords between Anwar Sadat and Begin. After 1973 and the Yom Kippur War between Egypt and Israel, it was felt that a mediation was needed. Otherwise, Egypt was very strong militarily at that time, and they did not want this to carry on. So again, Carter became the big mediator, and Sadat's statesmanship helped. Begin invited him to come and address their parliament. Sadat made a very courageous move, went into Jerusalem and addressed the Israeli parliament. And then they signed this peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which is held to this day. Now, this removed at one go the strongest Arab army as an enemy, as an adversary of Israel. Now, this was followed in 1994 with a similar treaty with Jordan, Israel and Jordan. So Israel today doesn't need to worry beyond a point, unless you get into a situation like they have got into today, about Egypt and Jordan, its two major neighbors. And this is where American mediation helped. There was another factor, and it's today a very important factor, is Iran. Now, Iran was not always an adversary of the United States, as all of you know. Under the Shah of Iran, Americans were very close partners. They were partners for energy, they were partners in strategic terms, and to the extent that when the Shah was being pushed out in 1949 and a Republican president was taken over, Mossadegh, it was a CIA and a Brit combined with the Brits, a coup that was organized which removed Mossadegh and brought the Shah back in 1953. Now, this, I've stayed some time in Iran, so I know that this is one of the biggest psychological obstacles to good relations between the two countries today. Very right-thinking Iranians say the Americans prevented us from growing as a normal republic. So we went from the Shah to the Ayatollahs. So it was they blame the Americans still for the 1953 coup. And on the other hand, the Americans can't get over what happened in 1979. What you see the picture when a group of Iranian students took over the American embassy in Tehran. They took embassy hostages and held them for 444 days. And they had put up posters like Vietnam wounded you, we will bury you on the embassy walls. And Iran has been called Shaitane-Buzurg ever since that. Those who have visited Tehran would know that there is a famous hotel with the American painted on the lobby floor, and every guy who comes in walks over the Americans, and so on and so forth. So these are again psychological, deeply entrenched problems which really have prevented a full reconciliation. They go to a large extent. The diplomatic relations have been severed since 1979, and they remain severed. Sanctions have been placed on Iran. And, there has been an effort through the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, which was signed in 2015. Unfortunately, that Americans under Trump withdrew from that also in 2018. So today, frankly, you're back to square one. With Iran, if there is a single adversary, if there is a single problem which the West has, particularly the United States, not the West entirely, because Europeans have a very nuanced relationship with Iran, it remains Iran. And Iran, by definition, then has a problem with Israel as a small America, as a small devil in this whole game, who is behaving doing everything at America's behest. And then you have already seen how the Iranians have built up tremendous influence in different countries, despite being under sanctions, despite being not getting any benefits of international engagements, but whether it is in Yemen, whether it is in Syria, in Iraq, and today you see with the Hamas, the Iranians do have a huge amount of influence. The third way in which the Americans have been influencing their presence is direct intervention, direct military intervention. Now, what you see here is what happened to Saddam's army after the American coalition came in Kuwait, when Saddam had invaded Kuwait. And the Americans decided they would come in, not alone, but with an international coalition of 38 countries. And then the Iraqis were pushed back, as we all know. Now here the US had several concerns. One, of course, was oil. The second was that Saudi Arabia, being a weak country, relatively weak in military terms, would be next target of Saddam Hussein. And the third, of course, was protection and survival of Israel. So they went in, senior Bush went in with a coalition with 500,000 American soldiers, and Saddam was defeated, but he was not removed. So they stopped one step short of regime change. That would come later in the next decade. But in the first Gulf War, there was direct military intervention by the Americans. So, which would happen in many different cases in different ways. Now, here you see 9/11. Everybody's familiar with that horrible picture. I need to go back on this. Yeah. And immediately, a series of things happened, which were American interventions in different ways. I have on the sidelines, you will see them. They went directly the invasion of Afghanistan for Al-Qaeda, followed by what the unfinished business of the first Gulf War was, that Saddam was not removed. Well, Iraq was again invaded in 2003 by George W. Bush on the fictitious basis that they had WMD. Later on, after Saddam was killed and everything happened, they found there were no WMDs. There was no evidence of WMDs. So this was a lot of egg on the face for the Americans after Iraq. Some things which Tony Blair and George W. Bush have not lived down to this day. So when the Arab Spring happened in the Middle East, a lot of discontent, a lot of protests happened in different countries, in different directions. Now, Libya, for instance, when the protests happened, Gaddafi threatened to shoot the protesters and kill everybody. And then the Americans felt that they had to act. But given what had happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, they were not really keen to go and put boots on the ground in such a large manner. And so they decided that we will go in as a humanitarian operation, a limited coalition for a humanitarian purpose. But when they actually went in there, they found that even that intervention influenced the civil war to such an extent that the rebels won, Gaddafi was killed. And whether or not they wanted to or not, there was another regime change. Now, when Syria happened, Obama was very careful. He didn't want to even do this humanitarian thing. So all he did was give some weapons to some rebel groups, etc., and hoped and did not want to cross into, in any major form, into another intervention. Now, he made a red line that if the Syrians, if Assad uses chemical weapons, then we will intervene directly. Now, Assad, from all accounts, did use chemical weapons against his own people, but Obama did not intervene even then. So the civil war continued, and as you all know today, where we are, with Assad more or less back there with a lot of population change. So there was American influence in the Middle East, American presence in the Middle East. It's been said that Americans are better at destroying countries than building them. So what has happened is there's been a lot of civil wars. There's been a lot of destabilization, some of which I have detailed here. And there has been nothing to replace it. There's been nothing in Syria to replace Assad. Is very much there. There's been nothing to rebuild the institutions in Iraq. I mean, the Americans thought that here's a country which we will break down completely. They destroyed the political party, they destroyed the army, they destroyed all the institutions and said, we will rebuild again. And then nothing. It's still chaos. Libya is chaos. So what happened is a lot of vacuums have been created in the entire area through these interventions. Now, whether these were right or wrong, history is telling us, but this is the impact that is there for all of us to see. So given all this background, and I'm going here to the edge of October 7, just before October 7, what was happening? There has been a decline in the US primacy that we have talked about because of all these events, all these interventions that I have detailed in the last slide. There have been other actors. The Russians keep coming in and out, not as strongly as in the past. The Chinese have become very active in the Middle East. With money, with infrastructure, with their Belt and Road Initiative. They came in very gently, very softly. But today, if you see, the Chinese have played a major role in getting talks going, in getting relations going between the Saudis and the Iranians. Sworn enemies. And the Chinese carry enough clout with both sides. In the United States, for instance, there has been a huge amount of war weariness. Too much blood, too many dollars have been spent. And there is a tremendous war weariness that, look, we are not sending our boys to fight Middle Eastern wars. We have sunk enough money. And this has particularly been underlined by how they withdrew from Afghanistan. So that is a very strong factor today in US policy as it evolves. China's rise, has also meant another thing. Mr. Obama called it pivot to Asia. And Trump made it the Indo-Pacific. So essentially it's the same thing. Much more attention to the Indo-Pacific. Relationships with the democracies there, including India, the formation of the Quad, etc., because they've seen that China's rise is directly threatening American primacy, American supremacy, American trade, American technology, and of course, in military terms. So there's been a huge shift of attention to the Indo-Pacific. Again, that's another whole chapter, which I'll just touch there and stop there. The third has been this up and down relationship with Iran. I already mentioned it. They joined the JCPOA in 2015, withdrew in 2018. So there's a lot of blow hot, blow cold there. Saudi Arabia, to whom there has been this huge commitment, which I detailed, is today a changed country. MBS, the crown prince and the veritable ruler, he is not going to be a lackey of the Americans in any way. And the counter is that the Americans no longer need Saudi oil. The Americans no longer need Saudi oil because today America is the largest net exporter of natural gas. They've started exporting their own gas, producing their gas, and 60% of oil for America comes very conveniently from Canada and Mexico. Only 5% of American oil comes any longer from the Middle East. So while oil remains a strategic asset, it is not a critical asset for the Americans. There have been other changes in West Asia, particularly on Israel. And here, of course, the Abraham Accords we have all heard about. Abraham Accords were American attempts to step back and let Israel normalize relations with the UAE, with Bahrain, with as many Arab countries as possible, so that they can have a whole set of allies which take care of American interests. Now, this was done largely under Trump. in my view, it has actually backfired because they thought of what Netanyahu has called this the outside-in policy. That if you sort out this normalization, the Palestinian problem will by itself solve itself out. Now, that has not happened. And the other trend was America had taken its eyes off the Palestinian issue. There was virtually no intervention during Biden's time. Trump had a very direct intervention, but not for the Palestinians. He moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. So in one foul move, he said that all this Palestinian stuff is nonsense. Let's normalize relations with the Arab countries. Let trade begin. Let money come in. The rest of the problems will be solved. So, and besides China, American attention has been diverted by Ukraine. That sort of speaks for itself. Now, October 7th, we all know what happened, so I won't go into those details. But given Israel's size, given Israel's population, it amounts to 15 9/11s in terms of people lost, in terms of damage done, etc., etc. And immediately Biden, again, there's so much to discuss here, but I'll just stick to these points. Biden went and expressed his full support to Bibi. He met the hostages, the families of the hostages. He met Bibi. He gave him a bear hug. He didn't like Bibi. Bibi doesn't like him. I have a quote there at the bottom of the slide which says, "Bibi, I love you. I don't agree with a damn thing you say." Now, this was an inscription which on a photo which Biden had given him, given to Bibi some years ago, and Bibi evidently keeps it on his desk. But one other reason why he went in there was to make sure that can we control Israel? Can we control Israel? Can we delay the ground invasion? And that to some extent he did. But along with that, he continued to give unhindered military support, even outside the Congress. Even last week, they have found a way to sell $100 million worth of tank ammunition to Israel without needing to go to the Congress. Now, what has happened is that all this is fine. They've been giving money. They've been billions of dollars, $14 billion. They moved in their forces into the sea, the aircraft carriers, to prevent an escalation. But the way the Gaza conflict has evolved, there has been an international repercussion, an international outcry. This afternoon, I was listening to South Africa's case at the ICJ. And the Americans are being seen as basically allowing this kind of killing of civilians. And Biden has been making really weak remarks. Far too many civilians are being killed. And he's on his 4th trip to the region in 3 months, but doesn't have much to show for it. The Americans have not called for a ceasefire, and only for humanitarian pauses, which also have not been. So in many ways, Bibi has not really bothered to listen to them. So the American policy today is these 4 objectives. These have been outlined by Pentagon. I've shortened them, but the Pentagon website has the full language on each one of them. US forces and citizens to be protected, critical security assistance to Israel, help them release the hostages, and deter escalation. Now, there is not a single objective says prevent civilian deaths. There is not a single objective here which says start a negotiation for a 2-state solution. So, but under pressure, they have been saying various things which have not been listened to. If I'm running out of time, Air Marshal, please tell me. I will shorten this.
Master, you can carry on. You can carry on, please. Yeah.
Okay, a few more minutes. So,
yeah, no problem.
So, this is the way the Americans are going. Unfortunately, what is beginning to look like is that the tail is wagging the dog. And this is getting to be an international perception that image of America is under damage. They're too soft on Israel. Everybody feels that since they get $3 billion subsidy every year, so the Americans should have a strong handle. Then the Americans are being blamed for double standards and hypocrisy, that you acted differently in the case of Ukraine and you're acting differently in the case of Israel. Thirdly, you are ineffective anyway. I mean, Biden goes there, Blinken has been there 4 times, and the Israelis pretty much are doing what they want. And complicit, that they are almost complicit. And there have been now the letter by South African lawyers, which is blaming the Americans. Let us see where that goes. Americans, on their part, feel that we have the picture that you see here is of the US veto against the ceasefire resolution, that they have been the only country who has not said call for a ceasefire. So there's little wiggle room, the Americans say, that if we stop the arms to Israel, or we are hard on Israel, Israel will then go even more crazy. Secondly, our adversaries like Iran, etc., will get very encouraged if we don't try to protect the Israelis. So they are saying that we really have little choice except to keep walking this tightrope, that Hamas must be finished, but please be careful of the civilians. Then their other problem is Ukraine is getting unhappy and China is becoming stronger because, again, what we talked about, the Indo-Pacific, etc., if you've noticed that the Quad Summit has been postponed. So the American attention is today fully back on the Middle East. They're trying to project themselves as somebody who's defining the future of Gaza, a better scenario for them. They are saying, today Blinken has made statements that, the Palestinian Authority must be reconstituted, it must be a revitalized Palestinian Authority. So just to please him, Netanyahu has said, we don't want to occupy Gaza. Earlier on, Netanyahu had said, we will always keep control. Anybody who knows Netanyahu knows that he's never, ever going to leave security control of Gaza. So the Americans, because of the Middle East, are in the danger of damaging their position as an international leader. Now, the way forward. Anybody's guess, but looking into the sort of glass, I think it's Americans can't withdraw, particularly after this crisis. So there's nobody there who's going to replace them. So if they have to protect Israel, if they have to protect their strategic presence, if they have to protect their interests against China, they very much have to stay. Even if oil is not critical, it is still strategic. The Persian Gulf is still strategic. The Red Sea is still strategic. Similarly, Iran has to be controlled from an American point of view. Otherwise, there is no other way that Iran can be stopped from becoming a nuclear power. The idea of normalization has been proven to be a fantasy. The Israel-Saudi normalization, which was meant to turn everything into a large shopping mall, is not happening. So one way forward, keeping everything as possible, is America invests more in diplomacy and reduces its military footprint, particularly given domestic politics in the United States. It needs to address underlying issues. For instance, that is why they're saying we want a 2-state solution. But nothing has been done by the Americans or the Israelis to move towards a 2-state solution for years. And they have to take a hard look at their relationship with Israel, as well as with their relationship with Iran. Because Iran, if you notice, has not got into the war directly. Iran is not interested in getting into the war because they don't want the Americans coming and bombing them. So there is a possibility that the silver lining of this crisis may result in a reassessment of American policy, may result in a more stable Middle East after several years. But I think I think I've probably run out of slides, so I will stop here and open to questions. So should I just stop my